Hello all, and welcome to my weekly series, Meanwhile in the West, where I read through letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, Senate reform urged, 21st of August 2014. On his current form, I think we can reasonably assume that Clive Palmer will fail to be re-elected come the next federal election. However, we are stuck with his Senate members for a lot longer. Something must be done to return the Senate to its purpose as a house of review, rather than a balance of power comedy club driven by small-minded egos and agendas. Stuart Smith Kalamunda. Okay, so Clive Palmer is the news for this week, and fully 4 letters this week are going to be dealing with him, so I'll leave him to the side for the moment. The reason I picked this letter is because it's saying it's about the Senate. So, like many ex-British colonies and those influenced by sort of the Westminster system, we have 2 houses of Parliament, and the upper house, the Senate, is dubbed the House of Review. And the basic idea being that laws start in the lower house, then they have to pass the upper house. The upper house cannot propose its own legislation, well, to a degree. It's more complicated than that, but that's good enough for our purposes here. And there's always this constant complaints about the about the Senate being unrepresentative and being, as I say here, a balance of power comedy club. Essentially what's happened is that it's relatively unusual for whichever party has power in the lower house to also have a majority in the upper house. And what this means is they generally have to negotiate with other parties in order to get their legislation through. Whoever has a majority in the lower house generally has just a bit less than a majority in the upper house, which means they only need a few more votes in order to get legislation through. So that pretty much any of the sort of 2 other major-ish parties, major or minor parties, or a bunch of micro parties or independents are enough to get legislation through. And that's what's happened here. So Clive Palmer's party, the Palmer United Party, has enough votes, especially with they kind of have an alliance with a micro party member. They have enough votes that the government, if the government can convince Palmer United to vote with them, they can get through any legislation. What this has meant is that the Palmer United Party has extracted all sorts of political gain out of this situation, so that whenever the government wants to get legislation through, even government that the Palmer United Party supports, they always threaten to block it and in return extract something out of the government that they want. And this has basically been the nature of the upper house forever, and is almost inevitable that if you have a house that is not just a rubber stamp, which it would be if, say, the majority party in the lower house also happened to be the majority party in the upper house. So in that situation, there's no really need to have 2 houses. Both the houses would be controlled by the same party, and whatever that party proposes would get through. So whenever you don't have that situation, and you have somebody else in control of that house, or nobody in control, as it usually is, you're always going to have to negotiate with other parties. Palmer United is not unique in its balance of power. As I said before, Labour, the Greens, Palmer United, and or a coalition of micro-parties and independents all could be considered to have a balance of power. It's just that Clive Palmer is more ideologically aligned with the governing party, and so the governing Liberal Party would much rather negotiate with Clive because they would have to give up much less and are much more likely to appease him for much smaller things. Now, the fact that Clive Palmer has pulled a bunch of stunts means that it's a bit more front page stuff, but in the end, he's not really getting anything out of them. They probably, he's getting the least out of them as any of those other parties would demand, which is why the Liberal Party are negotiating with him. In many ways, if he didn't have such a crazy persona and didn't go on TV and say crazy things, nobody would be batting an eyelid at this. And my maxim still holds that I refuse to take seriously anybody who talks about electoral reform who does not understand what Arrow's theorem is. So until you understand Arrow's theorem, I will not take you seriously on the topic of electoral reform. Next letter. He has support, 21st of August 2014. Why wouldn't Clive Palmer react the way he did, being pushed by the interviewer? He was only telling the truth. It is good that we have Australians like Clive and Pauline Hanson who won't cower and who say what they feel, seeing the rest of us don't have the guts to say it in public. I'm sure a large majority of real Aussies feel the same. Come on, send a letter. L. Williamson, Seville Grove. So, here's yet another one about Clive Palmer. And what I like about this one, firstly, is they managed to get a no true Scotsman in there, or in this case, a no true Aussie. Also, the fact that the majority of people writing in to this newspaper, so the demographics for this newspaper are definitely right-leaning and definitely much more racist than the average person in the population. So the fact that they don't agree with Clive Palmer's racist outbursts seems to suggest that he is not supported by a majority of Australians. The fact that he spent millions and millions of dollars of his own money on advertising, which is generally unheard of in this country, in order to buy a very few Senate seats and a single lower house seat, suggests that the majority of Australians don't actually support him. But what he is a boon to people like you who, don't feel able to spout their racist bullshit in public, because it makes you feel like at least you've got somebody to look up to, and at least maybe you're not the only person out there who feels that way. And the fact that you lump in Pauline Hanson, who is notoriously bigoted, far-right, anti-immigration, xenophobic Pauline Hanson, who is famous for not knowing what xenophobic meant, just goes to show that yeah, you are clearly not part of the majority, but you're doing that false consensus thing that a lot of people do when they find themselves in a minority, where they like to think of themselves as, speaking for the largely silent majority, which in this case is absolutely wrong. Thank goodness it's wrong. The Power of Attraction, 22nd of August 2014. I think I've figured out why boatloads or plane loads of asylum seekers bypass safe democratic countries that can accommodate them for Australia. We are one of the few and only countries that offer such a generous welfare system and much more. That'll do it. Brad Capes Kublup. Well, I couldn't go yet another week without an asylum seeker letter. So here we go. Yes. The problem is that the majority of refugees coming to this country by boat, or asylum seekers if you prefer, come from Afghanistan. Recently we've had Sri Lankans, and that's pretty much it. We've had Iraqis as well. So Middle Eastern or subcontinental. And between here and there are basically no countries safe democratic countries that can accommodate them. Indonesia is a democratic country, but is not as safe as Australia. It has its own ethnic issues and certainly can't accommodate refugees. The living conditions for refugees in Indonesia are poor, but that's only because the living conditions for many of their citizens are poor, and they simply cannot provide the kind of support that we do in Australia. And that's true for basically every country between here and Iraq. I can't think of a single safe democratic country that can actually adequately accommodate refugees between here and there. India is one that's been proposed, but India is not a safe haven for Sri Lankans, which generally the people who have ended up there, they are under the threat of deportation there. And also the living conditions are not good, because the living conditions for a vast number of citizens of India are appalling. And so the living conditions for refugees are no better. On that basis, I cannot fault asylum seekers for coming to Australia. The living conditions here are better. We are the only safe democratic country in the region that can accommodate them. In Southeast Asia, we are the only one, other than New Zealand, which is further away. And we have actually prevented people from asylum seekers from journeying on from Australia to New Zealand. None of them come here because of our generous welfare system, as you would put it. They come here because, yes, the quality of life they can expect as a refugee in Australia is better. It is a bare minimum. This is not because we are generous. This is because other countries in the region and across the world are unable to provide what we would consider basic living conditions to their citizens, let alone to non-citizens like refugees. The problem here is simply in that there is a great deal of poverty and very low living standards across the world, but particularly in our region. The solution is not to treat refugees in this country like shit. The solution is to try and improve living conditions across the globe. Trumping the R card, 23rd of August 2014. Clive Palmer is accused of racism against the Chinese. What criteria determine this? The old R card has become one huge politically correct bore, a cheap shot fired exclusively at the Caucasian. Thank your lucky stars, the R card wasn't in fashion before September 1945. These days, it already has our wet leaders running for cover. We're doomed, Captain Mannering. Tom Harvey Thornley. Now, I'm sorry that you, as a Caucasian member of the dominant social and economic group, and a male and almost certainly middle-aged or older, who has all the privileges that that entails, are bored of racism being a topic, and that are bored of people pulling out this hanging old idea that somehow people like you are racist, simply because you are. Clive Palmer called Chinese people mongrels. He said, now, it wasn't, he later claimed, and I would actually accept him on this, that he probably misspoke, that he was talking mainly about the Chinese government as a communist government. But at the time, and the comments that he made, and you look them up on Q&A, I'll put a link into that in the description, did have fairly racist overtones, this suggestion that Chinese people in general are mongrels. And that's a fairly Australian thing to call somebody, but it basically means a low person with few morals. And to paint an entire country as having low morals is basically racist by most people's definition. Now, you may be bored with it, and you may call it a cheap shot. The fact that it is generally used, not exclusively, but generally used against Caucasians, is simply a reflection that they are the dominant racial group in most Western societies that you would be thinking of. Now, Caucasians taken out of, or really white people, we're not really talking about true Caucasians, we're talking about white people, taken out of white dominant societies, do experience racism, and on a reasonable scale. So I wouldn't be surprised if in places like, say, I don't know, China, white people may well experience racism. Although in a lot of countries where they're minority, they still derive privilege from that. I know friends who've lived and worked in Southeast Asia where simply being white has got them jobs that locals can't get, because for some reason white people are seen as being more competent, more intelligent, or a better look for your business. And so yes, the fact that Caucasians are on the receiving end of it is simply a reflection of the fact that Caucasians are the people in power generally, and are generally the people who abuse that privilege. If somebody was racist towards me in this society, that is, if somebody was discriminatory against me for being white, they wouldn't have the full force of history, nor the full force of a large majority white population supporting them in that. And therefore the impact on me, as somebody who's never really experienced any racism, but I tell a lie, I have experienced discrimination. I had a girlfriend who was not white, and her parents were not happy with me being white. They would have preferred their daughter to have a boyfriend who was of the same ethnicity as them. And so I experienced that. But you know what? It hurt me far less, because this was not part of our society. This was not something I'd experienced anywhere else. This was not something that I experienced from anybody else, and therefore the pain and suffering it caused me was relatively minor compared to the kinds of experiences that, say, Aboriginal people have experienced for generations in this country. And yes, to compare this to World War II, part of the reason why, yes, racism has been, understood and argued against for a very long time, but part of the reason why it's been particularly called out since World War II is because a large part of the reason that we fought in World War II, at least some countries fought in World War II, is because of the deplorable extreme racism of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich in Germany. The fact that they were trying to exterminate entire races was what motivated at least some parts of the world to fight against him. And so yes, our public consciousness, which prior to that, most Western countries, most Western societies were quite happily racist against Jews. We kind of had to tone that back when we realised that that kind of racism supported at least some of what Hitler did. And so we were, to a small degree, culpable for the Holocaust. And yes, we fought against it. And so since then, yes, we have become less willing to be racist out in the open against people like the Jews. Hasn't necessarily translated into other cultures. And so yeah, the R card, as you put it, calls of racism have increased substantially since World War II, and that was a good thing, because that was an appropriate response after the horrors of World War II that were caused largely by racism, well, in some part by racism. Lastly for this week, Finding Fault, 26th of August 2014. With reference to Clive Palmer's comments about China last week, I do not blame the foreign countries who buy into businesses and properties here. I blame the weak Australian government for allowing Australian industries to go overseas and be bought out by foreign companies. Frank Cherry, Southlake. Okay, so this is a standard anti-globalisation type concern, which is, I don't know, possibly bundled up in racism. Generally, we are a lot less happy with, say, Chinese people buying out, Chinese government-controlled companies buying shares or land here in Australia. We're much more happy with, say, British companies doing it. So there are elements of racism here, but there's also elements of just plain old xenophobia, that anybody who isn't, nationalism, that Australian stuff should be owned by Australians. What this doesn't understand is that there's perfectly good, rational economic reasons for having fair trade and free investment between countries. Firstly, it actually does reduce the chances of conflict. Part of the rationale for the European Union was post-World War II. After having 2 world wars where Europe had essentially been tearing itself apart internally, the idea was that if you had closer economic ties, as well as cultural ties between countries, that you were less likely to have conflict. And this has, broadly speaking, worked. I mean, there has been a lot of conflict in Europe, but not to the same scale. And this could be for a number of reasons. But it's not out of hand, on the face of it, a completely unreasonable thing to think that it was partly to do with the tight economic ties between the countries. You simply couldn't mobilise the same war machine in modern Europe, because you don't have no one country has control over all the requisite parts of manufacturing, labour, service industries. No one country has, is self-contained in that sense. That they could create huge amounts of, war machines to fight other countries. And that's the same sort of thing happening here. So the Chinese are dependent on Australian coal, iron ore in particular, for smelting to create steel. Now, to the extent that they are amassing a army at the moment, we should be concerned about that. But basically speaking, them buying into Australian companies and buying Australian land is not really a threat to Australian sovereignty. Their ownership of it is governed by Australian laws, and if there was any suggestion that they were acting against the best interests of Australia, we would simply take it off them and we would nationalise it, and they wouldn't have any recourse to do anything about that. Our strategic partnership with countries like the US means that militarily there's not a lot. They don't have a huge amount of threat against us to sort of invade to steal our farmland or something like that. And we, as a society, have grown rich on foreign investment. I mean, in the 80s it was the Japanese, and we were terrified that the Japanese were buying out large swathes of Australia. That's gone by the by. Now it's Chinese, because that's the more recent wave, and I suspect that in 10 to 20 years we'll be looking back on this and not really wondering what the real issue was. We also have fairly strict controls here. We have what's called the Foreign Investment Review Board, which reviews all major purchases by foreign companies. We have a register. We have a register of, I think it's land as well as company ownership by large foreign companies, particularly ones like from China where they're state-owned, so that there is a sort of they're not just private companies, but they're also owned by the state. So all these things are monitored, they're carefully controlled, and they are subject to the whim of the current government. And so I don't share the same fear that you do. But then I wonder whether you are as informed on it as I am, and I'm not even particularly well informed, I'm just vaguely interested. Anyway, that's it for this week. I feel so much better for having had a rant. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.